Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the grim but incredibly important historical records of World War II. We're going to methodically break down the sheer scale, the twisted ideological roots, and the specific, chilling mechanisms of Nazi atrocities. We'll look at exactly how these horrors were systematized, who was targeted, and how the world responded when the dust finally settled. Let's get right into it.
We're going to set the tone right away with this powerful statement from the 1943 Declaration of German Atrocities. You might know it as the Moscow Declaration. Allied determination to arrest and bring to justice Axis war criminals. It is so vital to remember that even while the war was still raging, the totally unprecedented nature of these crimes was already demanding a mandate for future justice.
Here is our roadmap for the explainer today. 1. Ideology of the Nazi regime. 2. The Holocaust against Jews. 3. Expanding the target. 4. The weapon of sterilization. And finally, 5. War crimes and justice.
Section 1. Ideology of the Nazi regime.
Okay, so to really grasp how this happened, we have to understand this exact definition of Nazi ideology. It was a worldview combining extreme racism, nationalism, anti-Semitism, anti-communism, anti-Gypsyism, and eugenics to categorize people as biological or political threats. The regime didn't just target people at random, not at all. They evaluated human beings based on strict, fabricated biological and political criteria. To them, certain groups were literal racial threats to German purity, while others were political enemies. It wasn't just everyday prejudice, you know? It was a highly systematized worldview taken to the absolute most murderous extreme.
Moving on to Section 2, the Holocaust against Jews.
6 million. The sheer scale of human loss here is just staggering. The Nazis, along with their allies and collaborators, systematically murdered 6 million Jews in the genocide we now know as the Holocaust. Their radical anti-Semitism fueled this unrelenting, obsessive fixation on making Europe completely free of Jews. And it's this intensive primary focus on destroying the Jewish people that made the Holocaust so unique among the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany. Now, this machinery of terror didn't just happen overnight. It escalated step by step. It started back in 1933 with discriminatory laws specifically designed to force Jews out of everyday German life. Then, by 1939, following the invasion of Poland, this ramped up to imprisoning Jews in ghettos where disease and starvation were just rampant. After the attack on the Soviet Union in 1941, it shifted into literal mass shootings of entire communities. And finally, by 1941 and 1942, they built dedicated killing centers to systematically murder Jewish people using poison gas. It was a terrifying, highly bureaucratic escalation.
Section 3. Expanding the target.
While the Holocaust was the primary focus, the Nazis brutally targeted a whole host of other groups too. Roma and Sinti people, people with disabilities, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish elites, black and multiracial people in Germany, political dissenters, gay and bisexual men, Jehovah's Witnesses, and those they called social outsiders. Depending on the group, they used discrimination, illegal imprisonment, forced sterilization, torture, and mass murder. Just as an example, between 250,000 and 500,000 Roma people were murdered in a genocide driven by extreme anti-Gypsyism. Jehovah's Witnesses were locked up for refusing to swear loyalty to Hitler, and political opponents were thrown into camps just to crush any whisper of democracy. To really understand the chilling bureaucracy behind this terror, look at how the SS prisoner classification system worked. They meticulously categorized their victims by sewing color-coded badges right onto their uniforms. Gay men were forced to wear a pink triangle. Jehovah's Witnesses got a purple badge. People the regime marginalized as asocials, which often just meant those experiencing homelessness or poverty, wore black badges. Meanwhile, political prisoners wore red. It was this incredibly calculated visual way of sorting and completely dehumanizing human beings. 3.3 million. To further grasp the scale of death outside the concentration camps, consider that approximately 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German captivity. Because the Nazis viewed the Soviet Union as a communist, existential threat and considered its people racially subhuman, they treated Soviet POWs with absolute brutality, far worse than Western POWs. Millions died from systematic starvation, freezing to death without shelter, and outright execution. And shockingly, most of this happened within just the first 8 months of the German-Soviet War.
The Nazis basically treated anyone they saw as an obstacle as an existential threat. They would carry out these brutal pacification measures, which were essentially collective punishment.
So if a local resistance group acted out, German forces would massacre hundreds of thousands of totally innocent civilians in places like Poland, Belarus, and Greece. They would literally level an entire village and murder every single inhabitant as a terrifying reprisal. It's just hard to even wrap your head around.
Section 4. The weapon of sterilization.
We really need to look at eugenics. It's defined as a discredited scientific field arguing society could be improved by selective breeding, utilized by Nazis to eliminate supposedly inferior genetic traits. This is so critical because the regime actually embraced this as the biological justification for their horrific medical interventions. Eugenicists falsely pushed this idea that social problems like poverty or criminality were completely hereditary. So the Nazis took this totally discredited science and weaponized it. They used it to permanently prevent people they deemed inferior from ever passing on their genes.
And the impact of this ideology was just devastating. 400,000. Under the 1933 Hereditary Health Law, an estimated 400,000 Germans were forcibly sterilized. If someone was diagnosed with one of 9 supposedly hereditary conditions, things like schizophrenia, epilepsy, hereditary blindness, or a really vague term they called congenital feeble-mindedness, they were forced to undergo surgery. Doctors and public health officials actually nominated these individuals. It effectively turned the entire medical profession into a weapon of state terror.
Now, there was a really stark, chilling contrast between the regime's facade of legal process and its extra-legal terror. For German citizens with disabilities, the state set up special hereditary health courts with judges and physicians, basically to give the illusion of a fair trial. But then, for Black, multiracial, and Romani people, there was no law at all. The Gestapo literally operated a secret program to forcibly sterilize hundreds of multiracial children in the Rhineland, entirely outside the law, just because the Nazis despised what they considered race mixing. And inside the concentration camps, the search for mass sterilization methods just devolved into inhumane, often deadly experiments performed entirely without consent. You had physicians like Dr. Karl Klauberg at Auschwitz injecting toxic chemicals into the fallopian tubes of hundreds of Jewish and Romani women, trying to find a cheap way to sterilize thousands of people quickly. Meanwhile, Dr. Horst Schumann exposed prisoners' reproductive organs to X-ray machines. These procedures resulted in agonizing radiation burns, sepsis, organ failure, and death for hundreds of prisoners. It was the absolute abandonment of medical ethics.
This brings us to Section 5. War crimes and justice. The mandate to actually pursue justice for all of this started even before the war officially ended. Remember that 1943 Moscow Declaration we talked about earlier? That led directly to historic post-war trials. The Allies set up the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg to try the absolute highest-ranking Nazi officials. On top of that, the U.S. conducted its own military tribunals and army courts to hold perpetrators accountable. These trials were an incredible turning point. They basically laid the groundwork for modern international human rights law, attempting to bring some form of justice to a scale of suffering that is almost impossible to fully comprehend.
So I want to leave you with a final thought for our explainer today. We've just seen exactly how ideological hatred was combined with the bureaucracy of law, medicine, and the military to enact unimaginable horrors. So take a moment and reflect on this. Knowing the vast scale and bureaucratic mechanisms of these atrocities, how can international justice systems today better identify and halt systemic human rights abuses before they escalate into genocide? Why does understanding these specific mechanisms of history matter so much for protecting our future? Thank you for learning with me today, and keep asking the hard questions.